Think about difficult, shall we say, at points, historical royal members of the British monarchy. There's none more than gets everybody kind of upset and, shall we say, riled than this particular lady. Wallis Simpson, a woman really pre-social media who literally took the world by storm as a scandalous sort of person. You know, that was the portrayal that the British media decided to paint her as. Of course, history changes its tune as things move on. But what's interesting that I find out is when you meet people who've literally lived through that, particularly there, and knew that particular individual very well as an assistant, then you find there's a certain different story regarding, in particular, our late and wonderful Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth. Now, to many people, particularly of my generation, she was this fun-loving grandmother type figure that came out in fluffy hats, waved at people, and seemingly always had a happy face. Wherever she went, she seemed to sort of bestow a lot of cheeriness on a lot of people and lived to a wonderful old age. But as a lot of people don't realise, really, she didn't necessarily want that job being, of course, the Queen. When you think about it, she was the Duchess of York, and along with the Duke at the time, was more than happy to have a sideline role in the royal family. She really didn't want that level of intrusion, but of course history decided otherwise. Now, a lot of people basically state it was very difficult for her with Wallis Simpson. It was on that fateful day on September the 23rd that the very first crossed swords, literally, that is Wallis Simpson and the future Queen. Little did she know it at that particular point, though. And the story goes, of course, that they tried to get on and were as cordial, shall we say, as they possibly could be. But things were really taking a turn for the worst. You see, the Duchess of York, as she then was, along with the Duke, were residing out at Birkdale Hall, something which we now know a lot more of because, of course, it's the current home of His Majesty the King up on the Balmoral estate, around about 7 miles from Balmoral, so it gives you an idea of just how big Balmoral estate is. A lot of people want to know, well, why does His Majesty the King not wish to stay in the main hall? One might suspect that it really does simply associate itself with his late mother, Queen Elizabeth, and maybe he just needs a little bit more time to come to terms with the ghosts of that. That's what I've been told. But back to Wallis and Queen Elizabeth, or Elizabeth as she was then at the time. A lot of people tried to paint, you know, as I say, the Queen Mother out to be rather difficult. But as I've unearthed, there was a lot of more problems around Wallis Simpson than people seemingly meet the eye. She has been a figure in royal history that has literally, you know, shocked a lot of people and fascinated a lot of people. Even Madonna had a crack at making a movie a few years back all about her life. Wasn't particularly successful, but hats off for having a go. What was interesting, though, was the sort of argument that apparently led to the fallout. All is not what people really think. As ever, let me explain. You see, the story goes that, of course, the king at the time did not particularly get on very well with Elizabeth. And that might be because, you know, story goes that she did have her eye on him, as they say, and he'd very politely turned her down. She wasn't his type of woman, apparently too frumpy, too dumpy, and more importantly, not necessarily engaging, dynamic, and going to be showing him the dazzling sights that, of course, he was clearly looking for from a relationship with Wallis Simpson. Now, Wallis Simpson herself really just wanted not necessarily fame, but she certainly enjoyed the money side of living. You know, she wanted the very best things in life and famously said, as we all know, that you can never be too rich or too thin, and that was attributed to her. She was a person that lived life to the full, and even when she was married to Ernest Simpson, which apparently was a very happy marriage, she seemingly just wanted to have other things, always looking for a quest for something else. But the story goes, you see, that the real reason why Wallis fell out with Elizabeth, or indeed vice versa, was because that she described her as that, fat, frumpy and Scottish, and seemingly nothing at all like anybody she'd ever met before, and she couldn't understand the dowdy surroundings of Balmoral and wanted to do them up and get rid of all this tartan and the deer stalkers and all that sort of stuff. You can understand that, you know, somebody who's a vibrant modern woman who thinks, right, I've been given carte blanche, I can do what I want. Obviously, that's the story that goes, because apparently the Queen Mother, you know, I know I call her that, but Queen Elizabeth walked in and heard apparently Wallis Simpson and her chums mocking her. But the true story was a lot darker. And again, when you do dig a little bit deeper, you find out that actually it was Queen Elizabeth that was simply protecting not just her, but the king. Let me explain. The day that Wallis Simpson finally did arrive in Scotland for Balmoral, of course the king did not wish for Wallis Simpson to have to take the small branch line all the way to Balmoral from, of course, the main station. So he decided to go and personally pick her up, literally personally pick her up. Now this was his very first big mistake. You see, he had motor, sort of driving goggles on, as they call them, back in that particular day. And he thought this would be enough to keep him out of public view. But you see, the eagle-eyed paparazzi, even then, way back in the 1930s, were on his trail. You see, the bigger issue was simply this. On the day that he picked Wallis up, he was also supposed to be opening, by royal command of course, a local hospital. An unforgivable thing to do in that particular climate, even more so today, one might suspect. And while the public were absolutely appalled at this, while of course the Duke and Duchess of York deputised for him, which they had been doing on a number of occasions, all the while claiming of course that he was incapacitated, ill, not feeling too well, really he just didn't want to do it. Remind you of anyone? And then, on top of all of that, he was exposed in the media. Now, according to a very well-placed source who I recently interviewed, who is still around at a very ripe old age, basically he started, along with Wallis, to blame the Duke and Duchess of York about these leaks to the press and whereabouts how he was exposed for not doing his duty. But the bigger issue, and this is the real pivotal point for me in the Wallis and Queen Elizabeth saga, as you know, they did not get on throughout their lives. And even sadly after the demise of the Duke in the 70s, yes, Wallis was invited over, but it took all of her inner strength for the Queen Mother to forgive and move on. The simple reason was she did not mind being called fat, frumpy, Scottish, and not glamorous, not fashionable, all that sort of stuff. What really happened was she stumbled upon the crowd, literally in Balmoral, all mocking the king's stammer. She was appalled by this, more so the fact that, of course, the king was there. When I say the king, I mean the Duke of York, of course, George, later to be the king. She was just absolutely appalled by this. So the reason she allowed that particular story to go out about the fallout between her and Wallis was simply royal protection. She didn't want this to hurt the king any more than he already was. As we now know, he had a lot of problems with public speaking, all thanks to the wonderful film The King's Speech, but it was already well documented in royal circles. So once again, unfailingly, the Queen Mother decided to step in, rewrite the words of royal history. Now, a lot of people will dispute this, but a lot of people also know that is the true version of events. And that is the reason, really, why it was very difficult for the Queen Mother to forgive, forget, and of course move on, knowing exactly the stresses and the strains that he, and of course she later, placed upon her husband, which resulted in a very much early death. Yes, the endless cigarette smoking didn't help, but the added anxiety, worry and pressure certainly piled it on. And of course for the late Queen Mother to be mocked in such a public way by those you would have thought should have known better and perhaps had a little bit more respect was the ultimate betrayal. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.